Expansionism, the attempt to enlarge territorial and ideological influence beyond a country's borders and allies. Both the communist Soviet Union and democratic capitalist United States endeavored to spread their respective ideologies and increase the size of their spheres of influence. Both superpowers tried to achieve this goal in different ways. The Soviet Union tried to expand their sphere of influence by supporting and helping establish communist governments in the countries they had annexed from Nazi Germany during World War II. The citizens of these Eastern European countries who had just been liberated from the horrors of fascist Nazi regime were grateful to their Soviet liberators, and Soviet-backed political parties promised to give land back to the impoverished lower classes, who made up a majority of populations within those countries. The election of these socialist parties created communist satellite states that were allied economically by basically allowing the Soviet Union to become the overseer of the satellite countries' economies, along with allowing for trade to occur within its borders, and politically by the Warsaw Pact, which was a defensive alliance between all the communist states in Eastern Europe. The Warsaw Pact was actually formed in response to the creation of NATO by the United States and its allies. The communist stretch of countries eventually became known as the Iron Curtain, which was referred to as such by Winston Churchill. The Iron Curtain created a buffer zone between the communist East and capitalist West. On the other hand, the United States chose to go a different route of spreading its sphere of influence by instead framing their objective as allowing countries the freedom to choose which side they wanted to be on instead of forcing them to submit to their own ideological stance. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO for short, was a political response to the increasing threat of communist ideals that were prevalent in the post-World War II era. The organization consists of the United States and Canada, along with a majority of Western Europe. Economically, the United States instead chose to invest in countries who embraced liberalist ideals and countries who were fighting against the spread of communism within their own political climates. The most notable example of this economic approach the USA took in investing in other countries was the Marshall Plan, which was a nearly $100 billion, adjusted for inflation, investment in helping countries who suffered the brunt of the infrastructural damage caused by the Second World War. Over the 5 years the Marshall Plan was in effect, nearly 17 countries in Western Europe received funds and expertise provided by the United States. Soviet satellite states chose to reject the offered economic help from the United States, as the United States required countries to adopt classical free market policies such as privatization of industry, deregulation of trade restrictions, and deregulation of prices. The Soviet Union combated the Marshall Plan by initiating the Molotov Plan, which involved trade agreements between the countries and within the Iron Curtain that helped solidify their economies and not rely on resources from outside sources. The Molotov Plan was also similar to the Marshall Plan in the fact that it encouraged states to rebuild themselves in the image of the USSR. Communist Soviet Russia and the Western liberal powers had different views on how to deal with the ravaged country of Germany after World War II. So they decided to split up Germany into 4 zones of occupation, and its capital Berlin was also divided. There were 2 examples of containment being the policy of preventing the spread of a hostile ideology over the course of the split-up history of East and West Germany. The first example of containment in Berlin was the Berlin Blockade, which was the shutdown of all transportation systems that led to West Berlin through East Germany. This was an intentional act by the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in order to prevent what he saw as a spread of capitalist ideals within the communist-controlled area that surrounded Berlin. The Western Allies came up with a plan to deliver supplies to the struggling West Berliners by airlifting the supplies right into the heart of the city. The airlifting of supplies and resources was an act of opposition to the threat of further Soviet and communist oppression in Berlin and Europe as a whole. The next example of containment was the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961. East German troops were ordered by the communist government to build a wall that broke up the city into 2 sectors, East and West. The eastern part of the city, which was controlled by the communist German Democratic Republic, had long been losing massive amounts of its citizens who were fleeing to West Berlin to escape the communist system. The eastern government decided to prevent any more of its citizens leaving, as it would not be able to economically sustain itself, and built the Berlin Wall. The wall was not only a physical division, but also an ideological separator. As West Berlin was a symbol of the capitalist West, East Berlin was a symbol of the Iron Curtain of communist influence. The fall of the Berlin Wall essentially marked the end of the Cold War, as the oppressive symbol of containment was destroyed and the formerly divided Germany was unified into one nation. Deterrence is a method of Cold War which involves the improvement of one's ability to fight so that an opponent will not risk fighting them because of the expected outcome. As the United States and Soviet Union built up stockpiles of nuclear weapons after World War II, governments of the world were able to infer that should a hot war, which means armed conflict between the two nations, occur, the use of nuclear weapons would not only wipe both countries out, but most likely the entire globe. An example of deterrence would be MAD, which means mutually assured destruction. MAD for short. MAD meant that a hot war would be catastrophic for both Soviet Russia and the United States along with the rest of humanity, so the diplomacy was perceived as the most favorable option for both powers.
Détente is the relaxation of strained relations, especially political by verbal communication. The term in diplomacy originates from around 1912 from when France and Germany tried unsuccessfully to reduce tensions. Most often, the term is used for a phrase of the Cold War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union stood to gain if trade could be increased and the danger of nuclear warfare reduced. In addition, Nixon, a candidate from re-election, was under fire at home from those demanding social change, racial equality, and an end to the Vietnam War. Brinkmanship. Brinkmanship is the practice of trying to achieve an advantageous. The term was used repeatedly during the Cold War, a period characterized by tense relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. It marked a significant change in the conduct of foreign policy. Whereas the interaction between the states had previously been predicted on the balance of power largely based on a state's economic and military power and the desire to prevent any major shifts in the status quo. A state's possession of nuclear weapons created an entirely new set of foreign policy tools which it could use to influence others. The best documented case of brinkmanship was the Soviet placement of nuclear missiles in Cuba in 1962 and the U.S. response, which is now referred to as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, that's a hard one to say, to defend Cuba from the U.S. and to extend Soviet strategic power in the region by secretly placing medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles in Cuba, which threatened much of the continental United States. Instead of gaining a leveraged position over the U.S., Khrushchev's brinkmanship also brought the U.S. and the Soviet Union to nuclear war. The U.S. concluded after U.S. President John F. Kennedy revealed the presence of Khrushchev's weapons and the order naval quarantine or blockade around Cuba, which resulted in the Soviet Union withdrawing its missiles. Proxy wars. A proxy war is an armed conflict between two states or non-state actors which act on the instigation or on the behalf of other parties that are not directly involved in the hostilities. After World War II, the tension between communist and democratic forms of the government strained relations between the Soviet Union and the United States and provided the ideology underpinnings of the Cold War. These tensions almost boiled over into full-on conflict several times, especially as nuclear arms proliferation and testing advanced rapidly during the late 1950s and early 1960s. Both nations found it critical to expand their spheres of influence, largely by promoting leadership in the Third World that would be sympathetic to their cases. Arguably more important, however, was the ability to have friendly governments that could be used as allies to fight conventional wars or provide bases for the placement of nuclear warheads in the case of nuclear warfare. By using both diplomatic and military power, the United States and the Soviet Union attempted to carve out areas that could be utilized as staging grounds against one another.
Espionage is the practice of spying or of using spies especially to obtain secret information. It was the key tool of the Cold War and helped both superpowers in their policies of expansionism and containment. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, espionage was used to strengthen the American position when a spy plane photograph alerted the Americans to the Soviet missiles being installed on Cuban soil. When espionage was discovered and made public, it served to fuel feelings of paranoia and mistrust. However, according to Oleg Kalugin, a retired KGB Soviet intelligence major general, intelligence played a tremendous role in keeping the world from the brink from turning the Cold War into a hot war. Liberation movements is military and political struggles of people for independence from countries that have colonized or otherwise oppressed them. The group at the center of liberation movement fights, military and politically, against its perceived oppressor and campaigns for its country's independence, often with the goal of becoming its own sovereign state. Many liberation movements occurred in Latin America, Central America, Africa, and the Middle East from the 1950s to the 1980s. These movements were often funded and supported by one superpower or the other. In April 1955, Yugoslavia, under Tito's leadership, who ruled from 1946 until his death in 1980, became a founding member of the Non-Aligned Movement, which is an international organization of states in which the position taken during the Cold War by those countries in the United Nations that did not form an alliance with either the United States or the Soviet Union. This group of countries became a third voting bloc within the UN and pushed for more aid for the developing world. The Bandung Conference was the beginning of the non-aligned movement and emerged the concept of the Third World. At the conference, Indonesian President Sukarno said the following: "All of us, I am certain, are united by more important things than those which superficially divide us. We are united, for instance, by a common detestation of colonialism in whatever form it appears. We are united by a common detestation of racialism, and we are united by a common determination to preserve and stabilize peace in the world. Make the live and let live principle and the unity and diversity motto be the unifying force which brings us all together, to seek in friendly, uninhibited discussion ways and means by which each of us can live his own life and let others live their own lives in their own way, in harmony and in peace."